some particularly thorny but also really promising issues. I want to highlight a few of the objectives that we have today because I am a former middle and high school teacher, and it's always good to lead with your objectives. So a couple of things to highlight. One, I want to today identify some of the key contextual and institutional factors that can contribute to students' chronic absenteeism. You'll see that I'm going to take a particular angle with these things that will move us away from an attention necessarily on those things that might be considered the fault of the student or the fault of the student's family, and instead I'm going to be looking at things that might more easily and more importantly rest in on the desk of teachers, administrators, systems level leaders. Secondly, I'm going to describe some practices known to support student engagement, motivation, and attendance, things that we know through research that tend to promote students' decisions to engage, to stay engaged, and make the decision to attend school. And thirdly, I will suggest after each one of the major components that we'll discuss today, some specific resources for further investigation and implementation, in addition to some resources at the end and stuff that will be uploaded to the website. So that's the format for today, and of course at the end I will be talking probably far too fast, but at the end we'll make some time to answer any questions that you might have and potentially help you with direct you towards some resources. So next slide please, Bentel. Okay, so a key point before we dive into some specifics, and this shouldn't surprise any of us that are familiar with research or are thinking about the data-driven decision-making in our schools, that where we look determines what we will see. So in this case, where we look to determine what is promoting chronic absenteeism will determine what we see and therefore shape what we decide to do. And there are a lot of factors that contribute to chronic absenteeism. Some factors, of course, are located in the context, the habits, the decisions of the individual student and their family and their neighborhood. And of course, there are things that are far outside schools' control and far outside school systems' control to actually try to shape. However, there are a significant number of factors that are located in the procedures, the relationships, and the learning environments that we establish for learners in our schools, stuff that's on us, frankly. And the presentation that I'm going to give you today is going to focus on the latter, the procedures, relationships, and learning environments that we establish for learners in our schools. But I want to just add this big caveat here. That doesn't mean that I'm ignoring or discounting, of course, the more localized factors that happen to be closely connected to the student's decision, the family shaping or the family influences, and even neighborhood and regional influences. I'm not ignoring those. I'm just choosing to look in a different place and focus on those things. So next slide, please. Okay, one of the things we know about achievement motivation research is that the student's decision to attend regularly and engage purposefully is really the product of a whole host of forces that are internal to the student. They're psychological, they're external to the student, they are social, they're institutional in terms of how that student experiences school as a place where they are safe or they feel like they can connect, or the history of how that institution has treated students like that particular student in the past. They are political in terms of how power is manifested in relationships at school, and it's also a very pedagogical process, the extent to which they are learning and can map their learning over time and experience little wins. So really what we need to think about when we think about achievement motivation is not so much trying to parse which are the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. And the reason I say this is I see educators and folks constantly trying to determine, well, that's an intrinsic or an extrinsic motivator, and I'm less and less convinced that parsing, that distinction between those two is really that helpful for educators, because the catalyst for most of our behavior and most of our students' behavior in many situations may be external, but it's really integrated into a student or into our own internal drives and desires. The key for educators and education when it's done really well is to find out ways for the student and to create opportunities for the student to own the learning, to own their engagement, to own their motivation, to take control of it, to self-regulate in ways that are powerful for them so that they feel like they're agents in their decision and that the decisions that they're making are having an impact on themselves and others that is positive, and they can trace that. When those experiences are repeated over time, students tend to not need to distinguish between what's intrinsic and extrinsic because it feels owned by them all the time. And the big point from achievement motivation research and school engagement research is that without a doubt, and I can tell you this without a doubt, the research shows this again and again and again, all students desire learning experiences that offer opportunities for novelty, cool new stuff, For challenge, I want to be pushed. For competence, I want to be able to see what I can do well and see that developing over time. For autonomy, I did this. This was mine. For belonging, I'm connected to others and I feel included and invited here. And for meaning, this stuff that I'm studying has meaning for how I'm making sense of the world and my place in it. All students, every single one of them, desires learning experiences like that because that is the way the brain is hardwired. And that's how we've been trained over the millennia as social creatures to desire those experiences because it's good for the gander and it's good for the goose. However, amid a chronic lack of those experiences that are highlighted in orange on this slide in school, if students rarely have those experiences, students will look for those experiences elsewhere, which means they will tend to withdraw, they will tend to resist, or they'll turn to other non-academic pursuits. In other words, if the students aren't getting what they want from school, they're going to look elsewhere for it. And some of that looking elsewhere can drive the decision to disengage and to be absent from school. So one of the chief things I want to, as a takeaway for the day here or for this webinar, is to always resist, and I'll come back to this point later, always resist whenever you hear anyone making the claim that those students don't want to learn, those students don't value education, those students are not committed to being successful in school. The research suggests, and is repeatedly suggesting, that that is simply not true. All students want that. The question is, have they had enough chronic experiences of positive associations with those sorts of opportunities to make them continue to want to come back? And if the answer to that is no or not so much, then we can see why students might disengage. Next slide, please. So the motivation to attend school really comes from multiple psychosocial factors. Okay, one of them has to do with the student's experience of a point in anything they're doing, like the self-expectancy. What is it that I hope to get out of this? We want students to be able to muster multiple answers anytime they can to the question, why should I do this? If the answer to that, why should I do this, is because someone told me to, that is a very, very, very low motivator over a long period of time. It can work in short periods. It can work if the relationship between the person who's asking for it tends to be positive. But in the short term, or if the relationships are strained, why should I do this? If the answer to that question is, I'm not really sure, or it's not really motivating me, students are going to look elsewhere for interesting, novel, challenging opportunities. When these answers are minimal, they're strained or non-existent, the motivation to show up and lean in will also tend to be minimal, strained, and non-existent. Which is why I've said, and I'll continue to say, there's no such thing as an unmotivated student. And this may shake a lot of people's conceptions of what works in teaching, but really no such thing as an unmotivated student. There are, however, all kinds of demotivating contexts in which students are provided with little motivation to engage. And you can see it all the time to your students. Your student is necessarily not, they're probably not motivated in that particular context to study that particular content area. Maybe it's the quadratic formula. But after school, you see them practicing their free throws for hours with a friend, or you see them working really hard to get better and better and better at a video game, or they're really working hard on an art project in another class. It's not that the kid isn't motivated, it's that there's a particular set of contexts around that particular activity that shape their decision to engage. If there's enough demotivating context at school, it's not so much that kids are going to skip class, they're going to skip school because there's more opportunities for growth and novelty and challenge and interest and connection and belonging outside of the school environment than inside the school environment, hence chronic absenteeism. Next slide, please. So here are a whole host, and this is not exhaustive, but this is a whole kind of, I'm trying to be as comprehensive as I can be, a list of ways that we can think about school climate measures that affect students' decisions to engage and attend school. And I'm going to try to briefly highlight each one of them. So one is the experience of belonging and the experience of mixing. One of the things we know from studying students' risky behaviors, or their tendency to engage in risk-taking behaviors, is that the more rigid the social groups that students tend to be involved in other words, the more cliquey, the more divided, the more competitive social groups are at school, the tendency for those groups increases for them to engage in risky behaviors. If the group boundaries are more permeable, to take sort of the classic nerds versus jocks. If nerds are hanging out with jocks at schools and jocks are hanging out with nerds at school and they're getting along and they're seeing the value in each other's worldview, the tendency for nerds and jocks to engage in risk-taking behaviors tends to go down. So belonging is a really important aspect for us to think about because kids want to feel invited and they want to feel included in school. But if they over-belong, if they feel too attached and too enmeshed with a very particular narrow construct of their identity and they only hang out with students that are just like them, the tendency it would be that they might engage in more risk-taking behaviors that would lead them to opportunities that are more exciting and more interesting and potentially more dangerous outside of school. So we want students to belong and feel included, but we also want to make sure that they are mixing and engaging and grouped heterogeneously and finding different ways of meaning-making by being exposed to diversity. Second point, challenge and support. This is the old Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. For every time that we give a student a sort of challenge in school that's academic, we have to match that challenge with an equal amount of supports. And teachers are just genius at being able to do this work. I've been in classrooms in multiple districts around the country and was lucky enough to have teachers next door to me when I was a full-time middle school and high school teacher to see this happen all the time. But what we know is if there's too much challenge and not enough support, students will stress out and disengage and look for ways to excuse their confusion and their fear and being unsuccessful. If there's too much support and it's too easy and there's too much intervention by the teacher and they don't get to do it on their own or own the learning, students will also not take it seriously because it's just too easy and they'll raise their hand and say, what are we supposed to be doing again? Or can you tell me how to answer number 3? And the student doesn't ever own the learning. So we want to make sure there's a good mixture of I'm going to put you at the edge of your abilities and I'm here to help you. When we do that, we offer opportunities for students to feel like they're connecting to the teacher, they're connecting to the learning, they're connecting to the learning environment, they can feel themselves grow over time and they want to come to school. Thirdly, voice and choice. Can't stress this one enough, but when students feel like they don't have any autonomy, when they don't have any ownership over the learning, when they don't have a voice and they can't express their opinions, particularly for adolescents, we are shutting down rich opportunities to engage them at a level of meaning making that is really important for them as they're able to understand the world with complexity, understand their social relationships with complexity, and understand the content that you're trying to deliver with complexity. So offering opportunities for students to experience voice and have choice, even little things that they've studied, and this is a great experiment they've done in multiple different ways, just the experience of being able to choose between number 1 and number 2, you only have to answer 1 on a particular test, increases the level of engagement and motivation of students. If you just say you have to answer 1 and 2 or just this one question, students feel like it's not their learning, it's not their connected, they don't feel like they have a voice in it. When you get the experience of choice, particularly for adolescents who are individuating, they're trying to figure out who they are, they're trying to separate from one group or one family group and try to make it clear how they're different but also belonging. The opportunities to express themselves and the opportunities to make a choice in one's learning environment really draw students in. When students don't have those experiences regularly, it forces them out. Fourthly, teacher-student relationships. Research, lots of good social psychology research continues to underscore the fact that the relationships that students have with teachers can be a core factor that drives their decision to apply effort in classrooms and to do the work for the teacher. You know, lots of work has been done around discipline issues and around content delivery modalities that make it clear to us that there are many students who decide, I'm not going to work for you, you being a teacher with whom they don't have a good relationship. When that feature repeats over multiple classes on multiple days, where students get the experience like, you slighted me in class, you embarrassed me in front of my friends, I don't like the way you don't even know me, you bark orders at me, you don't explain the homework to me, I feel confused and chronically scared of failing in this classroom, I don't know who you are, you don't know who I am, you have no idea what I'm facing in my world. When those questions are answered in sort of negative ways and the teacher-student relationship sort of dwindles to just a function of I do homework for you to try to make you happy, kids are going to act out in immature ways, which means they're not going to submit their homework and they're going to stop showing up because that's where they have agency. They have a way to control that relationship by limiting that relationship. Teachers, therefore, need to really be encouraged and supported to focus on how they connect to every single kid. You have 175 kids in a particular day, that's going to be tough. But connecting with kids over a longer, say, give yourself over a 2-week period, you should have a good, meaningful touch point, not necessarily physical touch, but a good, meaningful interaction with that particular student over every student over a 2-week period was the objective that I set for myself when I had, 170 students over a singular day. So it's tough to do, but it's really important to focus on the quality of the relationships. Kids will do hard work for teachers they respect and adore. Kids won't for teachers that they don't. Next point is ownership of learning. It's really important. I've sort of stressed this in a couple different ways, that we have to find ways for kids to feel like they're choosing and they're moving towards things that feel like it's theirs, which means the content has to be culturally responsive, which means that the decisions that are offered in the classroom have to be relevant to how they see the content connecting to their outside world, and that the trajectory in their education is moving them towards something that they aspire to. If they don't, they won't have an ownership over the learning, and their decisions to engage, their decisions to attend school may dwindle. Next, personalization. Personalization is one of those words that means very different depending on which institution and which funder and which school district and which software platform you might be consulting. But for us at the Students at the Center program and at the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative, we understand personalization to be the extent to which content, relationships, challenges, and opportunities are targeted to an individual student's interests and abilities. And when that happens repeatedly over time, students will feel like school is for me, that it works for me, I am being met. I'm not just one of many in a large classroom. Personalization, therefore, is a fantastic way to differentiate instruction and to make sure that kids are feeling like they're connected to on an individual basis rather than just part of the larger herd. And there are lots of materials on the Students at the Center website about personalization, and there's lots of great software platforms and organizations that are using this as a focus in their school reform efforts. The last one in this column would have to do with recognition. This is very different from praise. Many of us are very familiar with the mindset work done by Carol Dweck and many folks who have worked in her shop at Stanford. When we recognize students' work, that's very different than when we praise them for doing something. So recognizing a student can say something like, Johnny, I see that in this paragraph you had an introduction that really opened up the possibility for the reader to engage this work on their own terms, and I see that you transitioned between the first paragraph and the second paragraph, and that you concluded in a way that was really compelling. What's your next plan for how you're going to take this work that's already starting out really well? How are you going to improve it? That is recognition. Praise would be walking up to Johnny and saying, good job on the first paragraph, and walking away. Doesn't help them understand what they need to do to improve, doesn't help them when it's sort of a relational improvement. They don't really necessarily feel seen and heard. The good job is sort of vacuous. We need to focus on recognizing the work that our students do and not getting caught up in praising. Even when teachers often say, I really like what you're doing right now, Johnny, that's helping the classroom to work better with each other. I would challenge even that modality, because saying, I really like what you do puts the student's behavior on a platform that is meant to please the teacher. And the point of being a student is not to please the teacher. The point of being a student is to get better and better and better at all of the things that you're learning and move toward a college career and civic readiness. So I will really want to argue for there's great researchers that have done lots of research on this, particularly as it impacts cultural responsiveness, of thinking about recognition. In the end, school is for me is the experience that happens if those things are met. A couple other items on the right side that I'll go quickly through. Performance versus mastery orientations. We want to stress mastery orientations in classrooms. When we stress performance orientations, we focus kids' attention solely on the extent to which their final performance will be met with a particular high grade or not. And if it's not, we sort of give them a grade and then they're stuck with that in the grade book. Mastery orientations move them towards constantly seeing mistakes as opportunities for growth and constantly looking for how they can get better and better and better at something. Mastery orientations are far more motivating than performance orientations. By the same token, we want to give students early and frequent little wins, particularly when the challenge is high. So if teachers are really good at this and they want to continue to get kids to kind of feel that little spurt of, yes, I can do this, I know this is hard, but this is going to happen for me, I'm getting better at this, we have to build in opportunities early in a challenging activity for them to go, hey, good, great mistake. Look what you just figured out now. You won't make that mistake again. Now try this technique to get it better. Oh, yeah, I'll do this instead. Those sort of early and frequent little wins and ways I would recognize those in the classroom will help students feel that learning is a process. It's not a destination that you end at, and that they'll constantly be motivated to come back and try harder. Competition in classrooms, as you'll see in the next point, tends to be quite the negative. And here, there's a really simple reason for this. Competition is really good for the kids that win. Competition always produces, however, losers. And in a compulsory education context, I would question whether that setting up the foregone conclusion that there will be losers in a classroom situation is an ethical move. I would question whether it is. So competition, whenever you're going to set that up, try to make competition set up so that kids are working together to be the best they can be, to beat their previous record at something that they did together as a group, to beat something they did before, or on occasion, to challenge another class's, score on something or whatever, and then have it be for something meaningless, like who gets to, have the ribbon next to their name or something like that. Competition, you don't want to have any sort of high stakes attached to it, because as soon as kids self-identify as losers, their reasons for attending school start to dwindle. And huge point here, the effect of tracking and other forms of ability grouping can be insidious on students' decisions to engage and to attend school. I'll get deeper into that in a moment. The prevalence of bullying can also send lots of students away because of negative school climate associations. And any person who says, oh, we don't really have a bullying problem at our school, yes, you do. Everyone has a bullying problem at their school. It happens everywhere. It's a natural outlet for status differences and power differences in any social system, particularly when kids are feeling ostracized or disincluded or threatened by that institution. They will act out in ways that use their status difference to make others feel smaller and to be in control. Bullying happens, and one of the ways that we can try to deal with chronic absenteeism, many kids don't come to school because they're feeling bullied. So one of the ways we can deal with chronic absenteeism is to directly address that. And there's lots of materials online. Making Caring Common is one of my favorite organizations that does some good bullying work. Facing History in Ourselves has produced some really good materials. And then there's the, of course, Stop Bullying Now website that has terrific stuff there too. And lastly, there's microaggressions, racial, ethnic, linguistic, class microaggressions, gender microaggressions, all kinds of microaggressions that students are able to get away with unless teachers are really paying attention to them. And when students are chronically experiencing microaggressions in school, they will start to learn that the place isn't safe for them. And the decision not to engage might mean, or not to attend school, might mean because they're looking for a safer place, which is outside of a spot where they're constantly feeling abused. So the question is, am I safe here? If students are answering no to that question, then chronic absenteeism is a likely outcome. Next slide, please. So takeaway here is, we really can't change what we don't understand. So one of the best things we can do as educational leaders, as systems level leaders, building level leaders, and classroom educators, department heads, whoever you may be, is to make friends with data. Capture how your students perceive their learning environment. Use surveys, use exit tickets, use focus group interviews. Constantly be checking with your kids, particularly the kids for whom we are holding ourselves most accountable, which I would argue should be the kids who are typically least served by what we've decided to do in our schools. We should be checking in with them consistently, frequently, to find out from them how it is that they're making sense of their classroom experiences and what we could do to support them to have it be more optimal. And when you analyze your data, highly recommend that you move beyond the averages. Don't just end up with a number that says, well, gosh, 80% of our students feel really safe here. We're doing pretty good. Next issue. No, no, no. The data of 80% of our students feel really good about the school climate here suggests to you that there's 1 in 5 of your students there that don't feel safe or don't feel good about being in that school or have concerns about that. That's where you want to dive in. Don't be satisfied with large average numbers. You want to look at the outliers, because the outliers help you to tell your story about how to get better. And one thing I might recommend is to sort of implement a motivation checklist among faculty and then work in teams to add to it as you discover which practices are most compelling for your students. So what do we know motivates students the best? So you can see from the previous slides, there's lots of stuff that there's out there. There's several pages in my book where I offer an early list for a motivation checklist that can be used in schools and then added to as you learn more about what your kids need. But start with something that you can start to check off and say, yeah, our kids are reporting this, but these kids aren't reporting that. We need to work on this. Get something that's tangible and get faculty to start working in teams to think about what they might add to it, and working with each other to look at each other's practices, to engage students together, do focus group interviews. use the geniusness at your school sites to help build a more positive and promoting environment for kids to avoid this chronic absenteeism problem. Next slide, please. So, switching to cultural responsiveness. Huge issue for us, made all that more glaring with all of the tensions in society around racial identity, around whiteness, around white supremacy. This is a big issue, and the extent to which schools are addressing this in ways that are really pro-social, that are helping communities, particularly marginalized and minoritized communities, to feel safe, connected, belonged, and challenged and supported in schools is a really important issue. One thing that I'm going to say about cultural responsiveness on the front there is that really we need to be thinking about how we're making ability differences salient in our learning environments. Whenever we do that, whenever we say this group over here is the A group, this group over here is the B group, and this group over here is the C group, or the green group and the yellow group and the blue group, or the college prep and the honors and the other track, whenever we're tracking in that sort of way, we should expect students' resistance, we should expect their withdrawal, we should expect decreased performance, particularly among students who don't receive the highest and most esteem-worthy labels. Particularly for those marginalized students who are already marginalized, minoritized by virtue of their social location. Anytime we track or create ability differences, students are going to look for ways to not get that label. Or if they are going to get that label, they're going to look for ways to check out of that environment that's conferring on them a negative association. So, sorting and ranking regimes in schools are typically quite raced and quite classed, and we see this again and again and again with research, Jeannie Oakes being among the leading with her book, Keeping Track. There really is no such thing as a kid who doesn't want to learn. I want to underscore that point. So we really need to be thinking critically about how our sorting and ranking regimes in schools might actually be creating the problem that we're trying to solve through other methods. So the question I'll pose here is, are students' decisions to chronically or to be absent from school driven by the fact that every time they walk into the school, they feel like the place is putting a dunce cap on their head? And if they want to walk away from school because they don't want to feel like the school is saying, you're dumb, we have low expectations for you, maybe we need to think about how that decision itself is actually a smart one for the individual student's feeling of self-worth and their life trajectories. One of the ways we can stop that from happening is by detracking our schools. So these subtractive schooling processes that can be really toxic and alienating, for example, when we force students who have an ethnic identity that is not quote-unquote white and middle class, for those students who get the chronic experience that they have to check their ethnic identity at the door in order to be successful, we subtract all of the cultural resources, the funds of knowledge, the insights and genius that are brought from people's individual cultural backgrounds, and we say to that student that, hey, in order for you to be successful here, you have to sound different than the way you talk at home and the way you think at home and the way you are at home. That subtractive process can convince students that this place isn't for me, this place doesn't represent me, this place doesn't care about me, and students would rather be bad than to feel dumb or uninvited, so they act out. And then we punish them for that acting out when actually the source of that feeling was on us, not from some sort of dysfunction in the student, which is why we really need to be thinking about issues of care. Authentic care is not caring solely about attendance and not caring solely about homework and not caring solely about test performances. Authentic care is caring about that student's sense of self-worth and how it may be raced, classed, ethnicized, gendered, all of those things in school, and making sure that we are catering it and personalizing it and making it culturally responsive in a way that makes that student feel like they want to come to school because that place represents them and cares for them as an authentic, full, three-dimensional human being with a culture that deserves respect. So it's really important to include cultural responsiveness when we think about what might be driving chronic absenteeism. Next slide, please. Another key component of cultural responsiveness is to be thinking about all of the fantastic research that's been done by Steele and many associates around reducing stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a psychosocial phenomena that basically forces the individual to think about how their performance might be reflecting on people like them, and so they take psychological resources that might otherwise be applied to the activity at hand, and they're now, the brain is preoccupied with thinking, oh, everyone's going to think that if I do bad on this, that I am representing a group in some sort of way, and that stresses them out. That added stress offers less possibility for higher order brain thinking, which offers less opportunity for success on challenging tasks. And stereotype threat has been found in every subpopulation that's been studied. It's been studied, I think, in over 20 different countries at this point. They continue to find a robust evidence base for it. And unfortunately, schools are often set up, classrooms, curriculum, activities are often set up in ways that trigger students to experience stereotype threat, and that forces them to shut down. I could go on and on about this here. I would just recommend people to Google stereotype threat, to look up research on stereotype threat. I know that Educational Leadership and Phi Delta Kappan have produced articles on stereotype threat over the years that are worth consulting. Lots of great materials out there that would help teachers to think about how it functions and how to keep it from happening. We also need to be thinking about how kids come to us from their neighborhoods where it may have been an unsafe bus stop, it may have been an unsafe bus trip, it may have been an unsafe walk to school. They may have had to take 3 buses or travel through areas that might not be that safe for them. Some kids arrive at school after having had to be tough all the way to school, and they can't just turn that off. They're used to being tough. They're used to being tough around their friends. That's part of sort of the survival instinct for a lot of kids in a lot of neighborhoods. So when kids say stuff to us that feels disrespectful, quote unquote, or that feels like they're threatening us in some sort of way, particularly for those who are white and middle class and come from environments where that sort of stuff would be deemed disrespectful, we need to see that as a tough front or a cool pose, all those different things, and not overreact to it. Because the kids, 9 times out of 10, maybe even 99 times out of 100, maybe 999 out of 1,000, are not actively interested in threatening anyone. What they're interested in doing is protecting themselves. And that tough front is often just a front for insecurity and fear, and hoping that they're going to have an opportunity of connection and belonging. And we need to make sure that we're not taking those fronts too seriously. We also need to check our curriculum. Who's most visible in our curriculum? Who is invisible in our curriculum? Who is most lifted up as being someone to aspire to? Who is not lifted up as much in our curriculum? We should try to make our curriculum as diverse as the students we seek to serve. Same with our staffing. Who is overrepresented among our staffing? Who is underrepresented? And what are we doing to try to reach out to those populations to bring up new generations of educators that represent the populations we seek to serve? And then last, as we connect with our families, which families tend to get the lion's share of our attention, information, and outreach? Are white middle class assumptions operating about parental involvement? Are they operating in or prevalent in your system? For example, we often think about parental involvement as if we live in a world where people have 9-to-5 jobs and they're able to take time off from their boss to show up at school days, volunteer at school, or come to evening events, that sort of, or come to athletic events. And we live in a radically different work environment than was when we started public education, 2 centuries ago. Right now, there are people working all kinds of hours and all kinds of jobs to make ends meet, as we well know. So we really need to think about what we mean when we say parental involvement. What we should be talking about is our level of parental engagement. What are we doing to connect with parents where they're at, and personalizing our responses so that the parents feel like this is a place for my kid and I can pay attention and want to pay attention to this, and I trust my school. That's on us. Next slide, please. So takeaway here. Decision to skip school or be chronically absent in some cases really should be understood as a rational, self-saving response to a learning environment experienced as toxic. The kid isn't wrong to skip school when going to school feels so bad. Okay? And if kids are telling us that, and they may not say it out loud, but they're telling us with their feet and where they go, we need to engage them not at a level of blame, not a level of fault, but we need to ask hard questions about the stuff that we're doing to create those experiences. Schools will tend to default to mainstream norms unless efforts to expand and enhance cultural responsiveness are undertaken. It's not because people are bad. It's not necessarily because people are racist. It's because the schools tend to value the things that represent those who are running those schools, and that's just the default. The more diversity we get in school leadership, the more diversity we get in educators who are in the classroom, the more likely those schools will tend to be more culturally responsive. And so an important question to raise here is, to what extent are the educators in your system or school prepared to reach and teach students from marginalized race, class, ethnic, linguistic backgrounds? And then also, how about kids with learning differences, those who live in foster homes, those transgender students? If your answer to that question is some are and some aren't, we need to hold accountable those educators and those systems level leaders and building level leaders who aren't yet prepared to do that work, and provide them support and accountability structures to make sure that they are. Typically what schools will do is hold accountable those who have the least amount of power in the decision in the environment, and that tends to be students and families. What we need to be thinking about is how we're holding ourselves accountable to create environments where students want to be at school and parents want to engage us. There are resources all over the world and all over the United States and all over the web about how to initiate and sustain conversations that reveal which practices will make the learning environment more culturally responsive, and I highly recommend that people consult those. And we have all tried that, we've all looked at them. There's some are better than others. I recommend checking them out and then talking to people who have used them to see how they work for them and how they adapted them. There's great resources there. Next slide, please. All right. Some points on exclusionary discipline. This got a lot of attention several years ago with My Brother's Keeper and with the Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education. Lots of scholarship from people like Russell Skiba and Ann Gregory and other leaders in the field, Pedro Noguera, Rich Milner, lots of people out there who have really been leading the field and thinking about the dangers with zero tolerance policies, corporal punishment, suspensions, and expulsions that have all demonstrated consistently negative effects and disproportionate effects on Black and brown boys in particular. So exclusionary discipline, I think at last count there's either 18 or 19 states that still allow corporal punishment, and there's actually some discouraging new legislation from some states who are increasing the opportunity and encouraging teachers and educators to use corporal punishment and bringing that back. The research on that is highly negative. It's not a good idea, particularly for students who are already minoritized and marginalized, and yet it continues. So the point here is that learning to live in community and to develop social emotional skills really requires the deepening of relationships, not the removal of those relationships. And exclusionary discipline actually punishes people by punishes kids by removing relationship, by excluding them, by ostracizing them, by pushing them away and pushing them out. And what we have to remind ourselves is that students will act immature because they have not yet matured. So many educators really need help in learning how to read and teach and engage students at the level of their resistance and their misbehaviors in order to reinforce behaviors rather than punish them. So a student swears in class, of course you could send them out into the hallway to think about, of course you could give them a detention. If it happens repeatedly, you might even be supported to suspend them. Probably not a very productive move for that individual student and not a very good move for the teacher-student relationship. How are we encouraging students to take different, more nuanced approaches that are good for the learning environment and keep them close versus pushing them away and punishing them with less connection? So educators often do establish engaging and structured learning environments, but they try really hard to do this, but they often end up with chaotic, repressive, or overly permissive classrooms. And they do this not because they're bad teachers, not because they're bad people, not because they don't care. It's because they haven't been shown, haven't given supports, haven't been observed to try new stuff, haven't been supported, haven't engaged their colleagues in ways that would allow them to create those new approaches that would be most pro-social for the students. And student misbehavior tends to result from these chaotic, repressive, or overly permissive classrooms. And student misbehavior is actually a symptom of the problem. It isn't the problem itself. The symptom of the problem is the environment that was created for that student. And we also know that disciplinary procedures can privilege white middle-class ways of behaving, which really contributes to the alienation of already vulnerable populations. If students, again, as I said before, if students come into school and realize that the only way for them to be taken seriously as a student is that they learn how to act white, if they learn how to act like the mainstream, then that's telling students that their full cultural identity is not welcome there. And so they then use their cultural identity in sort of an outlaw way, and it might be over-accentuated, and it might be used as a way to sort of engage others in a threatening manner. Again, those are decisions that are made in an immature way by a student who doesn't have much experience on earth who needs help and relationship to think about different ways of acting, but so does the teacher, so does the school leader, so does the system level leader need help in thinking about these issues and alternatives. Speaking of alternatives, next slide, please. One way to think about this is by using restorative practices. Think about it this way. We often send students away when they break rules, and this sends a lesson. The lesson is that exclusion, forced absence, is a way to resolve difficulties in learning and relating. We're telling them that. We're broadcasting them that. If things get sticky, if things get uncomfortable for you, disengage, go away, don't come back. That's how to be healthy. And no wonder that many students choose to be absent when schooling experiences can be difficult for them because we taught them that strategy. Restorative practices offer a fantastic opportunity to pull students in rather than push them away. Restorative practices, when they're implemented well, when they're implemented consistently across buildings and across systems, when they're implemented with fidelity and there's proper supports for teachers who do it, because it does require some rethinking of some old patterns about what punishment is supposed to do. When restorative practices are done like that, they create community, they solve problems, and they establish real forms of accountability rather than forms of accountability that are based on retribution and punishment and pain. So any outreach to struggling families or students really needs to be matched by in-reach efforts to assess the developmental and the cultural appropriateness of the learning environment. We have to ask ourselves hard questions about our schools, about ourselves, and equally and do that as we ask about our students and our families. If we're only asking hard questions about our families and our students, we're really missing the forest for the trees here. It's on us to create rich, inviting learning environments, and if we're not doing that, some of the student misbehaviors that we're going to see are going to be the symptom of the problem that we help to create. Next slide, please. So, big conclusion here, and then we're going to go to some questions if there are some from the folks. So if you have any, please feel free to start putting some in the chat, and Dantel and I will we'll go through those. So a little analogy here to finish up here. Think about gardening and about how we produce food for ourselves and all of our citizens. Good gardeners and good farmers really know what it takes to make plants flourish. When a plant doesn't flourish, they don't blame the plant. Okay? Instead, they look at the soil, they look at the exposure to sun, they look at the level of water, they check out how much nutrients are provided, and they look at all those different things around that particular plant and figure out how can I better nourish this plant to make sure that it grows to full fruition and gives us the nutrition that we need from it. Okay? Now, same with schools. A student's decision to attend school and engage learning opportunities with their best effort has everything to do with the quality of the learning environment. If we really want to eliminate chronic absenteeism, we need to focus some of our efforts on analyzing and changing the components over which we have the most control. And we don't have the most control over our neighborhoods, over our families, and often over our students. What do we have the most control over? Our school climate, the extent to which we're culturally responsive, whether we're using disciplinary strategies that actually work and have a research base behind them. And we have control over how we establish and sustain our relationships with our students. So rather than thinking about, and this is one way you might think about responding to those, well, this is all fine and great, but kids really just have to decide to come to school. Johnny doesn't want to learn. First, you can challenge the idea that students don't want to learn, because we know from research that they all do. And second, you can challenge the idea of saying, look, where are we going to get the most bang for our buck? Where are we going to get the most impact for our efforts? On the things that we actually can control. And that's why I focused today on climate, responsiveness, and discipline as a ways to think about what might be driving chronic absenteeism. Next slide, please. All right, so before we get to some questions here, just a quick highlight. Sorry, this is a shameless plug, but I did write a whole book about this. And I wrote this book basically to help educators at multiple levels. This could be state level leaders, this could be systems level leaders, district leaders, and school leaders, SEAs, LEAs, even community members, to think about what makes students resist school. Resistance being misbehavior, resistance being withdrawal, disengagement, chronic absenteeism. And my book is a way to outline the political, the pedagogical, the psychological, and the contextual factors that drive students to resist school. And that's to help us figure out how better to blame kids to do better, hopefully encourage them to do better, but to think about what we can do in the environments that we create and the specific strategies that we can deploy to get kids to want to engage, to be motivated, to relate to us, and to apply their best effort. So the book there is listed, and you can see where it is, and I've been working with some districts around the country on a few of these issues in more pointed fashion, and as always would welcome questions about that through my email or just through my website, which is engagingresistance.com. All right, with that, let's go to this next slide and see if we can get some questions from anyone, if anyone has them. Chantel, I would defer to you. Have any questions appeared in the chat function? And if not, let's make sure we have an invitation to anyone that's online to check in with us.
We don't have any questions, although one person did raise their hand, but no questions came into the chat function.
Copy that. If the person raised their hand would like to ask a question, we'd welcome that at this point.
Should I unmute them?
Sure, let's do that. We have a small enough number that we can do that.
Okay, the person who's raised their hand has been unmuted. If you want to just go ahead and ask your question aloud.
Was that me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I must have hit the hand by mistake.
That's all right.
Not a problem. Okay, so in the absence of other questions here, again, we have a couple minutes to do that, but maybe we can put 5 minutes back into people's day. I'll kick it to Chantel here, and just one final word on all of this. This work in dealing with chronic absenteeism is as complicated as anything that we try to do in schools. I think in the end, when we're asking really good questions of each other and of our practices, and we think about accountability not as how we punish those who are making mistakes, but we think about accountability as how we engage each other and improve each other's work and stay in relationship to do that, I think we're going to be more productive in the long run. I want to thank Chantel and all of the team at the Early Warning System group, the Attendance Works, the Mentor, and the My Brother's Keeper Alliance for all their support in making these materials available. I encourage people to check the website that should be coming out pretty soon. And with that, I will kick it to Chantel. Thank you again, Chantel.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. We hope that you found it really helpful and informative. This is just a reminder that the recording of the webinar will be on our temporary website for the center. I just put the link into the chat function so you can find it there. And please keep an eye out for all of our emails about the website, which we're hoping will be live very soon. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.